I bought my daughter a luxury house, but when I visited, she refused to let me in because my job embarrassed her. Thomas had never been a man to waste words on empty talk. His hands bore the battle scars of 4 decades wrestling with unforgiving engines and stubborn steel. His spine curved like a question mark from years spent hunched beneath the bellies of cross-country giants. Oil had seeped so deep into his pores it had become part of his very essence, and the metallic tang of his trade clung to him like a second skin. In his cramped repair shop, perched on the forgotten edge of town, he breathed life back into dying rigs, while weathered truckers spilled tales of endless highways and bone-deep exhaustion. For 40 relentless years, 3 sacred principles had anchored his existence. Work until your bones ache, keep your pride in check, and pour every drop of love you possess into your family. He never possessed riches, but he had something infinitely more precious: enough. Enough to stand tall, enough to sculpt a child's character with grit, brutal honesty, and the kind of warmth that could melt winter itself. Fate hadn't made him Elena's father by blood. She had materialized like a ghost at a desolate rest stop, a trembling 4-year-old specter clutching a battered plastic doll, her torn dress offering no shield against the merciless cold, abandoned by relatives who had treated her like discarded cargo. Thomas had stopped for nothing more than coffee and drove away with his entire universe transformed. Through weeks of suffocating bureaucracy and the kind of stubborn determination that could move mountains, that terrified little girl with eyes like broken glass became the blazing center of his world. He gifted her his name, his sanctuary, the very essence of his soul. In return, she handed him a reason to push beyond exhaustion, to chase impossible dreams, to believe that even the most shattered things, people included, could be made whole again. Elena blossomed in that modest house nestled behind the repair shop, her childhood soundtrack the thunderous symphony of diesel engines and the gentle sizzle of morning eggs in cast iron. Thomas moved heaven and earth to cocoon her in comfort. He crafted her a treehouse kingdom from discarded wood scraps, each plank hammered with love. He conquered YouTube tutorials to master the art of braiding hair, his oil-stained fingers learning gentleness. Every single day, he packed her lunch like a sacred ritual, tucking in handwritten notes that whispered fierce truths. You're stronger than you think. Money might have been scarce, but love flowed like a river, raw, unfiltered, and absolutely boundless. And for those golden years, that love was everything. As Eleanor matured, her brilliant mind began reaching beyond the shop's dust-covered horizons. She possessed the kind of intelligence that could light up entire cities, too magnificent to remain trapped in their forgotten corner of the world. Thomas embraced bone-crushing late shifts, juggled side jobs that stole his sleep, and made the heart-wrenching sacrifice of selling his beloved Chevy, all to fuel her college dreams. When acceptance letters arrived from prestigious universities, his chest swelled with pride that could have powered the entire town. Watching her glide across that graduation stage in cap and gown, he applauded with such ferocious joy that his weathered hands screamed in protest. The pain meant nothing. She was his masterpiece, his living, breathing triumph. College graduation launched Elena into the gleaming city, where she married into wealth that Thomas could never fathom. The chasm between their worlds widened with each passing season, but Thomas refused to let bitterness take root. His weekly calls became lifelines, care packages stuffed with her childhood favorites became love letters, and his visits, though increasingly rare, remained pilgrimages of devotion. At the shop, he transformed into a walking billboard of paternal pride. "My girl's designing skyscrapers that kiss the clouds," he'd declare, his voice ringing with unshakable conviction. "She's painting beauty across the world's canvas." No distance could dim his faith in her greatness. One bone-chilling winter afternoon, Thomas made a decision that defied every logical thought a man his age should harbor. After years of ruthless saving, he purchased Elena a house, not just any dwelling, but a palatial sanctuary in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. He emptied his life savings down to the final penny, auctioned off tools that had been faithful companions, and mortgaged his shop's future. When he pressed those keys into her palm, she didn't weep with overwhelming gratitude. Instead, she offered a polite smile, delivered a distant one-armed embrace, and murmured a soft, "Thank you, Dad." It wasn't the earth-shattering moment Thomas had envisioned, but somehow, in his boundless heart, it felt like enough. Or at least, that's what he desperately tried to convince himself. Thomas wasn't one to impose himself on anyone's carefully constructed world. He deliberately kept his visits sparse, terrified of becoming an unwelcome shadow in Elena's gleaming new existence, her marriage to wealth, her ascent to success, her metamorphosis into someone he barely recognized. But as months crawled by like wounded animals, an aching hunger consumed him. He starved for the music of her laughter, craved the warmth of her stories, desperately needed to feel like he still claimed even the tiniest corner of her universe. So one crisp Friday morning, driven by loneliness that threatened to swallow him whole, he stuffed his battle-worn duffel bag with hope, clutched a mason jar of his legendary homemade jam like a peace offering, and surrendered himself to the city-bound bus. No elaborate schemes danced in his mind, just the simple, soul-deep yearning to witness the palace he'd purchased for his princess. Maybe steal a precious hour over steaming coffee cups. The neighborhood struck him like a physical blow, a living, breathing magazine spread where reality felt too polished to touch. Towering iron sentinels guarded manicured emerald kingdoms, while luxury vehicles purred with aristocratic restraint instead of the honest growl he knew. His flannel armor and dust-baptized boots screamed outsider in this temple of perfection, but pride armor plated his chest. He stood like a conquering hero before the fortress. Her fortress, drinking in its breathtaking magnificence. His finger found the doorbell with the reverence of a pilgrim touching a shrine, anticipation painting dreams across his weathered features. He could already see her face exploding with shock and joy, could almost feel her body crashing into his arms, could practically taste the tears of reunion. Nearly a year had carved a canyon between them. The door surrendered, but revealed a stranger's face. Jeremy materialized like a perfectly pressed specter, his expensive cashmere sweater clinging to his frame, sockless loafers announcing his casual superiority. His gaze dissected Thomas like a scientist examining roadkill, contempt dripping from every calculated glance. "Can I help you?" The words struck like ice shards, each syllable sharpened to wound. Thomas managed a trembling laugh, his voice carrying 4 decades of gentle hope. "Just here to visit my daughter. Thought I'd surprise her." Jeremy's expression remained carved from stone. No warmth flickered in his eyes, no humanity surfaced. Instead, he delivered his verdict like a judge pronouncing sentence, "She's not expecting guests." And with that executioner's finality, the door began its inevitable swing toward rejection. But fate intervened. Elena materialized like an apparition behind her husband's shoulder, and Thomas felt his heart literally skip beats. She looked transformed, sculpted. Every strand of hair existed in perfect harmony, her makeup applied with surgical precision. The grease-stained little girl who once built castles from engine parts had vanished completely. Thomas ignited with joy, his face becoming a beacon of paternal love. "Hey there, pumpkin," he breathed, his arms opening like gates to paradise. But she remained frozen, a statue. Her eyes darted between Jeremy's disapproval and her father's desperate hope, before delivering the words that would brand themselves into his soul with molten iron. "Dad, you should have called. It's not a good time." Her voice carried all the warmth of a winter grave. The shame in her tone hit him harder than any physical blow. Thomas felt his throat constrict around swallowed dreams. "I just wanted to see you, honey." Maybe stay the weekend, if that's all right." The words escaped like prayers from a condemned man. She hesitated, a pause that stretched like eternity, her gaze dropping to his honest boots before seeking Jeremy's silent approval. "The thing is," she began, each word a small death, "we're having company over, important people, clients. I don't think this is the best moment." The subtext screamed louder than any shouted insult. He wasn't welcome. Not because of any crime he'd committed, not because of any words he'd spoken wrong, but because of his very essence. A mechanic, a man whose hands bore the honest stains of real work, whose presence threatened to crack the porcelain perfection of her carefully curated existence. He absorbed the blow with the grace of a man who'd spent a lifetime fixing broken things, even when those things couldn't be repaired. "I understand," he whispered, the words barely escaping his constricted throat. "Don't want to make trouble." He retreated like a defeated soldier, that pathetic mason jar still clutched in his trembling grip, a symbol of love that no longer had anywhere to land. Maybe some other time. Elena remained rooted in her doorway, a beautiful statue of everything he'd lost. She didn't step into the sunlight. She didn't bridge the canyon between them with an embrace. She simply offered hollow words. "Yeah, maybe." Then the door closed. Not with violence or fury, those would have been easier to bear. Instead, it whispered shut with the gentle finality of a coffin lid, like the last period punctuating the end of the most important story he'd ever lived. Thomas stood paralyzed in that designer purgatory, his shoulders carrying the weight of every sacrifice he'd ever made, staring at the beautiful barrier he had purchased with his life's work, but no longer possessed the right to pass through. Thomas couldn't bear the thought of surrendering to a bus seat, trapped with his devastation in a metal box hurtling toward nowhere. So he walked. Mile after punishing mile, his boots became instruments of penance against unforgiving pavement. He marched past neighborhoods that flaunted their prosperity like badges of honor. Trimmed hedges standing at military attention, marble fountains singing songs of wealth he'd never know, until civilization began to crumble around him. The streets fractured like his heart, weeds erupting through concrete wounds, like his pain breaking through carefully constructed composure. He craved air that didn't taste like betrayal, even if the city's exhaust-poisoned atmosphere was all the atmosphere offered. With each step, shame burrowed deeper into his marrow, like a parasite feeding on his soul. He refused to cry. Men forged in his generation, tempered by decades of quiet suffering, didn't shed tears. But something fundamental shattered inside him, not from the rejection itself, but from the earth-shattering revelation she was no longer his little girl. She had become a stranger, wearing his daughter's face. A neon hemorrhaging motel materialized from the urban decay like a beacon of desperation. He surrendered cash for a room that reeked of industrial bleach and the accumulated sorrows of 1,000 broken souls. Perched on the bed's edge like a man awaiting execution, he still clutched that mason jar, his 3-hour labor of love rendered meaningless. He had harvested every berry with his own weathered hands, imagining her face illuminating with recognition, maybe even hearing her whisper that it transported her back to simpler, sweeter days. But she hadn't even acknowledged its existence. He placed it on the nightstand with the reverence reserved for funeral flowers, staring at it as if this humble offering might somehow explain the inexplicable. The shop, his sanctuary, his second home, had already crumbled before his heart did. 2 weeks earlier, they had delivered his death sentence with corporate efficiency. Too old, they declared. Too slow for their brave new world. They hungered for new energy, whatever soulless phrase meant in their spreadsheet universe. He had buried this humiliation deep, refusing to burden Elena with his failures, terrified of appearing weak in her ascending world. But some treacherous part of his heart had harbored a secret fantasy, that she might somehow sense his desperation and throw him a lifeline. "Come stay with us for a while, Dad. Let's weather this storm together." Now he understood with brutal clarity. Even the purest love carried an expiration date stamped in invisible ink. Dawn dragged him back onto that bus like a condemned man returning to his cell. His hands transformed into lead weights, his heart a stone sinking through his chest. The window became his confessional as trees blurred into watercolor memories. That doorstep moment replaying in his mind like a broken record, scratching the same wound deeper with each revolution. Could different words have unlocked that door? Could he have fought with more ferocity to claim his rightful place in her life? But no. A man reduced to begging for love earns only pity's bitter scraps, never respects gold. And Thomas still possessed his pride, even if it had become the only treasure left in his ransacked vault. His apartment welcomed him back with the suffocating embrace of absolute silence, a quiet so complete it seemed to scream. The walls groaned under the weight of phantom memories, birthday celebrations that once shook the foundation with joy, Sunday dinners where laughter seasoned every bite, echoes of an era when love flowed as naturally as breathing. He collapsed into his faithful recliner, like a king surveying the ruins of his kingdom, his gaze settling on the empty kitchen that had once been the beating heart of their tiny universe. Self-interrogation became his new torture. What fatal flaw had he committed? He had poured his entire existence into work, sacrificing vacations that might have created memories, new clothes that might have earned respect, even his health on the altar of provision. And now, in life's final act, he found himself utterly alone, not even granted a chair at the table his own hands had built from nothing. But bitterness hadn't yet poisoned his soul. Not completely. He remained adrift rather than angry, clinging to hope like a drowning man, clutching driftwood. Some indestructible part of him still believed Elena might call, might remember the man who had been her entire world, not the unwelcome stranger at her pristine door, but the hero who had mended her broken bicycle with magic hands, who had painted entire universes with bedtime stories, who had held her trembling form after her first heartbreak shattered her young world. He hadn't surrendered. Not entirely, but for now, time stretched before him like an endless desert, and silence had become his only companion. 7 days crawled by like wounded animals dragging themselves toward death. 7 sunrises brought no word from Elena, no message crackling with regret, no apology bleeding through digital silence, no acknowledgement that he still existed in her universe. His phone became an altar of desperate ritual. Every morning he performed the same sacred ceremony of checking, not because logic suggested contact, but because hope was a savage master that refused to release its grip. Hope was the cruelest addiction known to man. It fed on emptiness and grew stronger with each disappointment. He even surrendered to weakness once, dialing her number like a man possessed, just to drink in the honey of her recorded voice. But when the beep demanded words, his throat became a tomb. What confession could he offer? "I'm drowning in missing you. Why did you amputate me from your life like a diseased limb?" The accusations burned behind his teeth but died before reaching air. Reality began its systematic assault on his remaining dignity. Groceries transformed from necessity to luxury as his bank account hemorrhaged what little lifeblood remained. Rent loomed like an executioner sharpening his blade, and without employment, his savings evaporated faster than morning dew in hell's furnace. He considered surrendering his pride to janitorial work or begging for mercy at gas stations, but his spine had become a twisted monument to 4 decades of labor, and his knees screamed protests with every movement. He had traded his body on the altar of provision until nothing remained but broken machinery. The employment world worshipped at the shrine of youth, casting aside calloused hands and silver hair like yesterday's newspapers. The world had sprinted forward, leaving men like him choking on its dust. Then the phone erupted like a gunshot in his tomb of silence, but the caller ID revealed Jeremy's name, not Elena's. Thomas's heart performed a desperate dance of hope, Perhaps they had recognized their cruelty. Perhaps Jeremy was extending an olive branch dipped in remorse. But hope became roadkill in seconds as Jeremy's voice sliced through the receiver like a surgeon's blade. Cold, calculated, businesslike. Elena thinks it's best if you don't show up unannounced anymore. She's trying to maintain an image. And your presence, well, it complicates things. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, each syllable a hammer strike against his already fractured soul. His jaw locked with such ferocity, he feared his teeth might shatter like glass under pressure. Speech became impossible. His vocal cords had transformed to stone. Jeremy's voice continued its assassination. You understand, right? You're retired now. You should focus on relaxing. Maybe stay out of the city for a while. Retired. The word detonated in Thomas's chest like a grenade. They thought this was some golden years fantasy, some voluntary descent into leisure. They didn't know he had been discarded like scrap metal, thrown away when his usefulness expired. And now his family, the people he had loved with every atom of his being, were performing the same surgical removal. Jeremy's words weren't merely rejection. They were the final blade thrust into a man already bleeding out from 1,000 cuts. The call's end left Thomas suspended in a silence so profound it felt solid, wrapping around his throat like a hangman's noose. Something fundamental died inside him in that moment, something innocent and trusting that had somehow survived 40 years of life's brutality. He had clung to the sacred belief that family meant forever, that loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional love were currencies that retained eternal value. But now, with devastating clarity, he understood he had been living inside a beautiful lie. The world his heart remembered had been buried long ago, and he had been mourning at an empty grave. That night, driven by masochistic compulsion, he exhumed a photo album, Elena's 12-year-old masterpiece, crafted with construction paper and infinite love. Page after page revealed their vanished paradise. Him cradling her sun-kissed form at the beach, their fishing poles crossed like swords in victory, his weathered hands teaching hers to cast lines into silver water, the tree house rising like a castle from his determination and her dreams. In one photograph, her crayon had drawn a lopsided heart containing the words, "Daddy's Girl," in purple letters that had once been his entire universe. He stared at that drawing until his eyes burned like desert sand, memorizing every imperfect curve, every innocent stroke. Then, with movements heavy as funeral dirges, he closed the album, returned it to its drawer tomb, and surrendered the room to darkness. That was the final night Thomas allowed himself the luxury of tears. Dawn arrived like a funeral shroud, dragging Thomas from fitful sleep with the metallic taste of despair coating his tongue and rejection's crushing weight still camped on his chest like a malevolent spirit. His apartment had transformed into an Arctic wasteland overnight, not from any mechanical failure, but from the bone-deep cold that emanates from absolute loneliness. He shuffled toward the kitchen like a ghost haunting his own life, only to discover his refrigerator had become a monument to his diminished existence. 2 lonely eggs, a bread crust that could serve as archaeology, and milk that had surrendered half its contents to time's relentless march. The irony struck him like a physical blow. He had once kept Elena's refrigerator bursting with abundance every week, transforming grocery runs into acts of love, and now he could barely sustain his own survival. He consumed his meager breakfast in cathedral silence, his gaze fixed on the chipped ceramic mug that bore Eleanor's kindergarten masterpiece. Crooked flowers painted in primary colors that had once represented pure joy, but now resembled archaeological evidence of a civilization that no longer existed. Desperation eventually drove him from his tomb apartment into the world's unforgiving embrace. The sidewalk had become a treacherous mirror of black ice kissed by merciless rain, while the gunmetal sky reflected his soul's landscape with frightening accuracy. His pace resembled a funeral march, partly because his knees screamed protests with every step, partly because he wandered without purpose through a world that seemed determined to forget he existed. Perhaps the community center would offer sanctuary, free coffee that tasted like hope, and quiet corners where he could pretend to read while actually hiding from his own thoughts. Anything to escape the deafening silence that had colonized his home like an occupying army. Fate intervened outside a modest grocery store where chaos had erupted in miniature. A young woman battled gravity and circumstance as shopping bags surrendered their contents to the sidewalk's hungry embrace, while her toddler transformed her coat into a flag of surrender with insistent tugging. Oranges rolled like escaped suns across wet concrete, and desperation painted her face in shades of exhaustion. Thomas didn't pause to consider. His body moved with muscle memory of kindness, bending to rescue scattered fruit despite his spine's furious protests. Surprise bloomed across her features like morning flowers, quickly replaced by gratitude so pure it nearly stopped his heart. "Thank you," she gasped, words carried on breathless relief. "I'm sorry. My husband's deployed, and it's been a rough week." Thomas offered a smile that felt rusty from disuse. "No apology needed. I've had a few rough weeks myself." Her insistence on purchasing coffee became a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. They claimed a battle-scarred bench outside the store, steam from their paper cups rising like prayers toward an indifferent heaven. When she asked about his life, he found himself offering fragments, just enough truth to remember what humanity felt like without bleeding out completely. She didn't dissect his words or judge his failures. She simply listened with the rare gift of complete presence. And when he mentioned Elena, his vanished career, and how swiftly his universe had collapsed, her eyes reflected something he'd forgotten existed: compassion without the poison of pity. "You sound like a man who gave everything," she declared with quiet conviction. "That doesn't make you weak, that makes you good." Those words branded themselves into his consciousness like healing fire, illuminating his journey home with unexpected light. He couldn't recall the last time someone had offered kindness without demanding payment, had seen his worth without calculating profit. For the first time in an eternity of weeks, he felt substantial again, not invisible, not discarded, but present in a world that had seemed determined to erase him. One small act of mutual kindness had pried open a door in his heart that had nearly rusted shut forever. Perhaps existence still harbored surprises, gifts he couldn't yet imagine. That evening, driven by inexplicable impulse, Thomas opened a drawer that had become a graveyard for forgotten objects. Inside lay an ancient wooden box, his treasury of loose change and crumpled receipts, the archaeology of ordinary life. Beneath this mundane collection lurked a lottery ticket he'd purchased on whim 2 weeks earlier, when despair hadn't yet calcified into resignation. The clerk had mentioned a record-breaking jackpot, and Thomas had chuckled at the cosmic joke of hope masquerading as mathematics before promptly forgetting the slip of paper's existence. Something indefinable compelled him to retrieve that forgotten ticket and summon the winning numbers on his phone. His hands trembled like earthquake victims as he compared digits that had once seemed meaningless. Once, twice, a third time because his mind refused to process what his eyes reported. The phone slipped from nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor like a fallen star. Thomas sat in stunned suspension, his world suddenly rewritten by the impossible truth. Every single number was a perfect match. Thomas stared at that slip of paper as if it had materialized from another dimension, his heart hammering against his ribs like a prisoner demanding freedom. He rescued his phone from the floor with movements slow as ceremony, triple-checking the date, the drawer, the cosmic alignment of digits that had transformed from random numbers into life-altering destiny. They blazed back at him with undeniable truth. Every single one. A lifetime of sacrifice, of being invisible, of accepting scraps from fortune's table, and then this thunderbolt from a clear sky. His first emotion wasn't euphoria, it was the vertigo of disbelief, followed by terror so pure it froze his blood. He had descended to absolute zero, owned nothing but heartbreak and humiliation, and now the universe had handed him everything. The whiplash contrast made his stomach revolt against reality. What cosmic joke was this? What would a broken-down mechanic even do with wealth that defied comprehension? It felt like grasping smoke. He approached the window like a man walking to his own execution, pulling aside the curtain with hands that belonged to someone else, half convinced he'd find cameras documenting his delusion or government agents preparing to reclaim their mistake. But the street outside remained defiantly ordinary, rain-slicked asphalt reflecting streetlights, the distant wail of sirens threading through the urban night symphony. He collapsed into his chair, clutching the ticket like a live grenade that might explode and erase this impossible moment. Could he even claim it? Did he possess the courage to step forward and declare himself worthy of fortune's attention? Then one thought detonated through the chaos, colonizing his mind, and he spoke it aloud like an incantation against despair. "I'm not worthless." The words hung in the air like battle flags, daring the silence to contradict them. For the first time since unemployment had branded him as obsolete, his voice emerged steady and unbroken. Dawn transformed him into a warrior, preparing for battle. He donned the same winter coat that had served him faithfully through 15 brutal seasons, frayed cuffs and patched elbows bearing testimony to his struggles, but wore it now like royal armor. He craved invisibility, not spectacle. The bus carried him toward his appointment with destiny, while his heartbeat composed symphonies of anticipation. At the lottery headquarters, the clerk barely acknowledged his existence as she fed his ticket into the scanning machine. But when electronic circuits recognized his numbers and erupted in celebration, lights flashing, buzzers screaming victory, she transformed into a statue of shock. "Sir, you need to come with me," she whispered, her eyes expanding to cartoon proportions. Thomas nodded, with the calm of a man who had already survived his own execution, though his thoughts sprinted like racehorses toward the finish line of disbelief. They escorted him into a temple of corporate privacy, where coffee materialized like magic and a suit-armored official introduced himself as regional director, confirming the miracle Thomas's heart already knew. $24 million had chosen him as their destination. The paperwork felt heavier than anchor chains as they placed it before him. "Do you want publicity?" they inquired, probably expecting him to leap onto their media altar. He shook his head with the force of absolute conviction. No. No cameras. No names. Just peace. They nodded with professional understanding as he signed documents with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves, each signature rewriting his existence. In that sacred moment, tectonic plates shifted inside his soul, not because of money's power, but because he finally commanded the steering wheel of his own destiny. His journey home became a pilgrimage through his former life. Instead of rushing toward his apartment sanctuary, he wandered like a ghost, revisiting earthly attachments, past the gas station where he had once purchased penny candy for Eleanor, transforming pocket change into childhood magic. Past the elementary school he had repainted during one blazing summer, volunteer labor that earned no gratitude, required no recognition, given simply because it needed doing. No parade had celebrated his service then. No applause had acknowledged his sacrifice. But with each step now, he felt his metamorphosis accelerating, not into the man others had pitied or discarded like broken machinery, but into someone with the terrible freedom to choose his own future. Survival had graduated into becoming. That evening found Thomas enthroned in his faithful armchair, lights dimmed to cathedral reverence, his mind churning with possibilities vast as galaxies. He could vanish completely, relocate to some distant paradise where his past couldn't follow, live anonymously among strangers who would never know his story. The appeal of such escape sang to him like sirens, calling sailors toward peaceful oblivion. But deeper currents moved through his consciousness, and he recognized a truth that made his pulse quicken. There remained unfinished business in this theater of his humiliation. People had revealed their authentic selves when they turned their backs on his need, but they had also handed him an unexpected gift by showing him exactly who deserved his loyalty and who had forfeited it forever. Now fate had armed him with resources beyond imagination, and the universe seemed to be whispering suggestions about justice, dignity, and the kind of reckoning that didn't require revenge or rage, just truth delivered with surgical precision and the quiet satisfaction of showing them all exactly who they had foolishly underestimated. The old man they had dismissed as a burden was about to teach them a lesson about the dangerous mistake of judging people by their bank accounts rather than their character. Thomas didn't sleep that night, not because of excitement, but because of clarity. For years he had poured every ounce of himself into others, raising a son not of his blood, standing in the shadows, giving without expectation. But now he saw things with new eyes. The rejection, the insults, the abandonment, they weren't reflections of his worth, they were reflections of theirs. And now, with this new power in his hands, he had decisions to make, not just for himself, but for the legacy he wanted to leave. The first step was to find a lawyer, not just any lawyer, a good one, discreet and experienced. He wanted to build something that would last, something thoughtful. He met with a woman named Linda Chang, whose reputation for both sharp thinking and quiet compassion was well known in town. When she asked what he wanted to do with the money, he smiled softly. "I want to disappear from their lives, but not before showing them who I am." She tilted her head, curious. "And who's that?" He looked out the window. "A man worth remembering." Together, they set up a trust. Thomas wanted most of the money to go to causes close to his heart, a shelter for older men who had been forgotten, scholarships for blue-collar kids who never had a chance, and a local fund for sick elderly people with no family. "It has to be anonymous," he said firmly. "No one needs to know it's me." Linda nodded. But he also wanted to keep just enough to start again, to live with dignity, quietly, in a place where no one knew his past. Then came the most delicate part of the plan. He asked Linda to help him purchase a property, cash, under a private company name. A small but elegant cottage outside the city, with a view of a lake and a wide garden where he could finally grow his tomatoes in peace, a place not even Daniel or the others would find. And then, one more thing. "I want to send them something, a letter," he said. "No anger, no accusations, just the truth." Linda agreed. Together, they began drafting it. The letter wasn't long, just a few pages. But every word carried weight. He reminded Daniel of the day he first adopted him, how small he had been, how scared, how Thomas had chosen him with love, not obligation. He listed the quiet sacrifices, the mortgage help, the school payments, the times he went without so Daniel could have more. And then, without bitterness, he wrote, "Now that you've made it clear I'm not welcome, I will honor your wish. But remember this, I never once saw you as a burden. I hope someday you understand the difference." When the letter was done, Thomas didn't cry. He felt peace. He had spent his whole life being the quiet man in the background. Now, he had spoken, just once, but in a way that couldn't be ignored. He sent the letter through his lawyer with no return address, no fanfare, no signature beyond Dad. And then he packed his few belongings, locked the apartment door for the last time, and left behind the life that had forgotten him. Daniel had just come home from a long day at work when the envelope arrived. No return address, only his name handwritten on the front in a familiar, shaky script. He almost threw it aside, assuming it was junk or something unimportant. But something made him stop. Something in the way his name was written. He sat down, opened it, and as his eyes scanned the first line, his hands froze. The voice on the page. It was unmistakable. It was Dad. At first he read quickly like it was any other letter, but by the second paragraph, the words began to sting. Thomas hadn't written in anger. No accusations, no curses, just truth, brutal, quiet truth. He reminded Daniel of the first day they met. "You were scared. I was too. But I chose you with love." And then came the list. The years of rent covered, the groceries paid for, the bills quietly handled, things Daniel had never even noticed. His face flushed with shame as he realized how much had been done for him and how little he had given in return. His wife walked into the room, laughing about something on her phone until she saw Daniel's face. "What's wrong?" she asked. He didn't answer, just handed her the letter. As she read, her expression shifted from annoyance to surprise to quiet guilt. When she finished, she didn't say a word. For once, even she couldn't argue. The room fell painfully silent. Daniel lowered his head. "He's gone," he whispered. "I told him to leave, and he actually did." He tried calling. Of course, there was no answer. He tried texting, emailing. Nothing. The phone was disconnected, the apartment number deactivated. It was like Thomas had vanished. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt the weight of true loss. Not the loss of death, but of dignity, of loyalty, of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing, and now he was gone, not angry, not bitter, just done. Over the next few days, Daniel couldn't focus. At work, he fumbled tasks. At home, he grew quiet, distant. His wife tried to move past it. "He'll come back, old people always forgive." But Daniel knew better. This wasn't a tantrum. This was final. He found himself revisiting childhood memories, Thomas walking him to school, waiting up late when he missed curfew, fixing his car in the rain without complaint. All the times Thomas had shown up, and all the times Daniel had turned away. He went to the old apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse, but the mailbox had a new name. The landlord said the unit was empty and that the old man had left no forwarding address. Daniel stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the door that used to mean comfort. Now it meant regret. He placed his hand on the knob, whispering, "I'm sorry, Dad." But the door didn't open. There was no one left to hear him. I found a room to rent in the back of an old boarding house, tucked away on the edge of a sleepy town. It smelled of mothballs and dust, and the floor creaked every time I walked. But it was mine. For the first time in decades, I was alone with my thoughts. No bills to worry about for anyone but me. No one calling me a burden. No noise. Just silence. It felt like breathing for the first time after being underwater too long. In the early mornings, I would rise before the sun and walk the nearby trail. My knees didn't like it, but I did it anyway. I'd sit on a bench at the top of a little hill and drink my cheap thermos coffee, watching the sky shift from deep blue to gold. For once, I had time. Time to remember my wife's laugh. Time to feel the grief I had buried for years while taking care of everyone else. Time to miss being a father and let go of the son who no longer saw me as one. People in the town started to recognize me, the old man who always tipped well at the diner, who listened more than he talked, who helped a young boy fix his bike chain on a Sunday afternoon. No one knew what I had lost. They just saw what I gave. It felt different here. I wasn't the man who got kicked out. I was just Thomas, and slowly being just Thomas started to feel like enough. One afternoon, I went to the local gas station to buy a scratch-off ticket, not because I expected to win, but because I used to play them with my wife. It was our silly little ritual every payday. I bought one and walked home, barely thinking about it. I almost threw it in the trash before scratching, but then I did. And when I saw the numbers, I blinked, then I laughed, then I checked again. I had to sit down. I had just won $2.3 million. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the ticket, not shouting, not jumping up and down, just still. like life had handed me a moment to breathe again, the kind of moment where everything could change. But I wasn't thinking about cars or vacations. I was thinking about what this meant. I had nothing, and suddenly, I had everything. But the question wasn't what I would do with it. It was, who would I be now? That night I sat at my window and looked out at the quiet street. I thought about all the years I gave, to my son, to his family, to everyone but myself. I thought about the pain of being pushed aside like an old coat no one wanted to wear anymore. And yet, in that pain, I found something stronger. Dignity, peace. A version of me that wasn't defined by what I gave, but by who I was. And now, I had a choice. Not to get revenge, but to start again, on my own terms. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not the woman who ran the boarding house, not the waiter who always brought my coffee, not even the clerk at the gas station. I kept the ticket hidden in an old cigar tin under my bed, wrapped in the receipt. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. Like I had been handed something sacred, and I wasn't ready to disturb it just yet. For once, I had control over something nobody could take away. I spent the next week doing exactly what I always did. Morning walks, a book at the park, simple meals. I needed time to let the news settle, to let it reshape me slowly. I wasn't a man meant for yachts or private jets. I was a man who remembered his wife clipping coupons with a smile. A man who once worked 3 jobs so his son could go to summer camp. Money didn't change that. If anything, it made it all clearer. I opened a private bank account under a lawyer's name and moved slowly, deliberately. No fanfare, no sudden disappearances. I paid the rest of my rent a year in advance. I left a tip at the diner that made the waitress cry. I bought a new pair of walking shoes, and then I made a list, not a bucket list, a list of people who had shown me kindness when I had nothing, strangers mostly, faces that smiled without knowing who I used to be. But there was one person I couldn't get out of my mind, my son. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted him to grovel or regret, but because I needed to understand how we had become strangers. I raised him, I held him when he had nightmares. I coached his little league team. I sat through every school play, even the bad ones, and somehow he had decided I wasn't good enough to sit at his table anymore. I thought about calling, about showing up with the check and watching his eyes change, but what good would that do? The truth was, if I hadn't won, he still wouldn't have wanted me around, and that hurt more than anything, because I realized then, love that's only present when you're useful isn't love at all. It's transaction, and I was done being a transaction in someone else's life. So instead, I drove to the shelter downtown, the same one I nearly ended up in, and I asked to speak to the director. I told her I wanted to help, quietly. I didn't want a plaque or a photo on the wall. I just wanted to make sure no man who'd lost everything would ever feel like I did. Invisible, unwanted, like his life had expired. She cried. I almost did too. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something that truly mattered again. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't travel to Paris. I bought a small house on a quiet street, with a porch big enough for a rocking chair and a garden my wife would have loved. I planted lilies in her name, and at night I sat under the stars and whispered stories to her. About the people I helped, about the second chance I'd been given, about the man I was becoming, not because I had money, but because I had peace. I had no intention of ever going back, not out of spite, I just didn't see the point. My life had moved in a new direction, one that didn't revolve around whether my son saw my worth or not. But the past has a funny way of calling you back, not with fireworks, but with a whisper. And one morning, while trimming the hedges in my new little garden, that whisper arrived in the form of a knock. I wiped my hands and opened the door, and there he was, Michael, my son, standing on my porch like a stranger who'd gotten the address wrong. He looked older, thinner. The confidence he used to wear like armor had cracks in it now. I could see it in his eyes. Something had broken. And for the first time in years, he didn't look down at me. He looked unsure, human. "Dad," he said, as if the word itself had weight, "can we talk?" I didn't say anything for a moment. I just stepped aside and let him in. He sat at my kitchen table like he used to when he was a boy. Only this time, there was silence between us instead of laughter. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask why I looked healthier, calmer. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket and laid it gently on the table. It was a pink slip. He'd lost his job. "I thought you might gloat," he said quietly. "After everything I said to you, after what I did." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pride either. I felt sadness. Because I could see in his face what I'd been carrying all those years, shame. And now he wore it too, but didn't know what to do with it. "I'm not here to gloat, son," I said, voice steady. "I'm here because I never stopped being your father, even when you stopped being my son." He looked down, the guilt blooming across his features like spilled ink. "I was scared," he whispered. "Scared of not living up to everything you gave me. Scared of being seen with you when I couldn't explain why I let you sleep in a garage. I thought success meant distance." I nodded slowly. "And I thought love meant sacrifice. Maybe we were both wrong." There was a long silence between us. Not the cold kind, but the heavy kind, full of things unspoken and years wasted. Eventually, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me about the lottery?" "Because money doesn't fix what you broke," I said softly. "It only reveals what's already true." Michael sat there, staring at me like I'd just spoken in a language he'd never heard before. For a long time, he didn't say anything, just looked down at the pink slip between his fingers like it held all his sins. "You're right," he finally said. "Money doesn't fix anything. I've had money, and it didn't make me a better man. It just made me a more distant one." I leaned back in my chair, watching him. I didn't offer sympathy, not out of cruelty, but because I knew this moment needed silence more than comfort. He had to sit in it, to feel the weight of everything he'd pushed away. For the first time, my son looked like a man who had stopped running. "I see pictures of you on the news now," he said almost sheepishly. "The old man who donated millions to schools, to shelters, to people who needed it most. I was embarrassed of your job, but now you're more respected than I've ever been." "I don't know how I got it so backwards." I gave him a small smile. "It wasn't backwards, son. It was just lost. Pride does that, makes you forget where you came from and who helped you get there." His eyes welled up. "I didn't just forget. I erased you." That sentence hit me like a quiet thunderclap, but I nodded. "Yes, you did. But I never erased you. Even when I was sleeping in a cold garage, I prayed you were warm. Even when you ignored my calls, I hoped you were safe. I never stopped being your father, even when you stopped being my son." He looked away, ashamed. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "I'm not offering forgiveness," I said gently. "I'm offering truth. What you do with it now, that's on you." Michael buried his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked back up, something had shifted, a humility I hadn't seen in years. "I don't want your money, Dad. I want a second chance. If you can find it in your heart to let me make it right, I will." I nodded slowly. "Then start with dinner." He blinked. "Dinner? Tonight? Your wife? The kids? Here, I'll cook." I gave him a crooked smile. "You might have forgotten, but I make a mean shepherd's pie." He let out a breath of disbelief, then a quiet laugh. "You'd really have us all over." I looked him dead in the eye. "Son, I didn't win the lottery to buy things. I won it to be reminded that I was never poor. I just hadn't been valued. And maybe now, it's time we remember what family actually means." That afternoon, I stood in my small but warm kitchen, apron on, sleeves rolled, peeling potatoes like I used to when Michael was a boy. My hands moved from memory, the same motions I'd done when I worked nights at the diner, when he sat at the counter doing homework. Back then, dinner was more than food. It was a peace offering, a ritual, a way to remind him, "I'm here." I'm trying. As the shepherd's pie baked in the oven, its smell filled the house. Rich, comforting, a scent I hadn't realized I missed. I set the table with real plates, not the chipped ones I usually used alone. I lit a small candle, more for symbolism than light. Every movement felt ceremonial, like I was preparing not just a meal, but a moment, one I'd waited decades for. At 6 on the dot, there was a knock. I paused, heart thudding louder than I expected, and opened the door. There stood Michael, holding the hand of his youngest son, my grandson, who I'd never really known. Behind him, his wife, nervous but smiling faintly. "It smells amazing," she said softly, as if afraid to break the tension with volume. I welcomed them in. Michael hesitated a moment at the threshold before stepping inside, glancing around at the simple decor. He looked smaller in this house than he did in his sleek suits. "I forgot how warm your home feels," he said. "It's different from ours. Not better or worse, just lived in." We all sat at the table, a little stiff at first, like guests in someone else's memory. The children fidgeted, his wife made polite conversation, and Michael watched me closely, as if still trying to figure out who I'd become, or perhaps who I always was. Over dinner, I asked my grandson about school, my granddaughter about her drawings. I didn't press, I didn't prod, I just listened, like I wished someone had done for me all those years I was alone. Then, as plates emptied and the tension softened, Michael cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, voice low, "do you remember that Christmas when I was 16? You gave me that leather jacket I wanted so badly?" I blinked, surprised. "Of course. I worked 3 double shifts to afford it." He nodded, eyes down. "I never said thank you. Not really. I just wore it like I deserved it, like you owed it to me. I didn't realize you gave up your only day off that month to pay for it." I looked at him, my throat tight. "You were my son. That was enough." He shook his head. "No, you were more than just enough, Dad. You were everything. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say that." The room fell quiet, not heavy, just full of unspoken memories, of pain, of gratitude, and of the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this table could finally be a place where a family came together, not out of obligation, but out of love. Just as I was clearing the dishes, trying to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't crumble from the weight of Michael's words, the doorbell rang. It was almost 7:30, too late for a delivery, and far too late for neighbors. I looked at Michael, who seemed just as puzzled. Slowly, I walked to the door, wiped my hands on a towel and opened it. On the other side stood Helen. It took me a moment to place her. Older now, hair streaked with silver, but still carrying that composed grace she always had. Helen had worked at the school cafeteria with me back in the day. We shared long shifts and quiet stories during breaks. I hadn't seen her in over 15 years. I hope it's okay," she said gently. "I ran into your daughter-in-law last week. She told me tonight might be important." I blinked, stunned. Michael's wife stepped forward. "I invited her," she said softly. "I found her number in some old papers. After everything you told me about your past, I thought maybe it was time you had someone from then remind you who you really are." Helen stepped in carefully, carrying a small photo album in her hands. "I kept some things from those days, Thomas. I always meant to give them to you, but I never knew if you'd want the memories." She sat beside me at the table, gently opening the book. Inside were faded photographs of us wearing hairnets and aprons, arms flung around each other after long shifts. One picture showed me reading to kids at the school Christmas event, a time when money was tight, but laughter still came easy. Michael leaned over the album in awe. "Dad, I've never seen these." I chuckled, a little hoarse. "Neither have I, in years." Helen tapped a photo where I was patching a boy's torn backpack, one of Michael's classmates. "Your father always stayed late to help the kids who didn't have much," she said. "He was the quiet glue of that school. Half the teachers never knew his name, but every kid did." Michael looked away for a second, rubbing his temple. I spent so much of my life thinking you were just an old man stuck in a job he hated. I never saw this side. I met his eyes, because I never showed it to you. I was too busy surviving, Michael, and too proud to explain. Helen smiled at me warmly. You were never just a cafeteria worker, Thomas. You were a caretaker, for the children, for the teachers, for your family. I just wish you'd let people see it back then. As the night deepened, we sat together, flipping through memories and slowly unwrapping the parts of my life I'd buried to keep everything else afloat. My grandchildren leaned in close, asking questions, and I answered for the first time in years with laughter, not bitterness. Sometimes it takes someone outside the family to remind us what we've forgotten to remember, not just who we are, but who we've always been. A few days after that evening with Helen, the house felt different. Warmer, somehow, like the shadows didn't stretch quite as far. Michael had started calling me more often, and the grandkids asked me about old stories, now eager to hear about the life I'd once tried to bury. I was sitting by the window, a mug of tea, warming my hands, when the doorbell rang again. This time, it was the mailman, holding out a thick envelope with handwriting I hadn't seen in years. My heart paused. It was from my late wife, Martha. The return address was old, from a nursing facility she stayed at for the last few months of her life. I opened it slowly, and inside was a handwritten letter, dated just a few days before she passed. It began with her familiar, graceful loops. My darling Thomas, if you're reading this, it means you've finally had the courage to stop hiding from the world, or maybe life forced you out into it. Either way, I knew one day this letter would find you when you needed it most. I felt my throat tighten. Her words carried the same warmth I remembered, like her voice had traveled through time to reach me again. She wrote about the life we built together, the struggles, the small victories, the sacrifices. She admitted she knew I had carried too much of the burden silently, too proud to show pain, too devoted to complain. And then she revealed something I never expected. I knew you were saving every penny for Michael's education, but what you didn't know was that I started saving for you too. Every holiday bonus I got at the florist shop, every little side gig, I put it in a separate account under your name. You've always looked after everyone else, Thomas. I wanted to make sure someone looked after you. Attached was a bank statement from a trust fund in my name. It wasn't millions, but it was more than enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to live, enough to dream again. But even more powerful than the money was her final paragraph. You've spent your whole life proving your worth by working until your back hurt. But the truth is, your worth was never in what you did. It was in how you loved. You were a good husband, a good father, and I see now, even if others forgot, you never stopped being that man. It's time to let the world see him again. Love, always. Martha. I sat in silence, tears spilling down my cheeks before I even noticed. The letter lay open in my lap, like a doorway to forgiveness, not from others, but from myself. That afternoon, I walked to the park, letter in hand, feeling lighter than I had in decades. Not because of the money, not because of the sudden reconnections, but because, for the first time in my life, I finally understood that I had never been invisible. I had been seen, loved, and now remembered. The next few weeks felt like a slow sunrise after a long night. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking up with the weight of shame or disappointment pressing on my chest. Instead, I woke up wondering what I might do that day. Not what I needed to survive, but what I wanted to experience. I bought new clothes, not fancy ones, just simple, comfortable pieces that actually fit. I replaced my old, worn-out shoes. I finally took Helen up on her invitation to join the community center's book club. And yes, I brought muffins on my first day. Her grin when I did made me laugh for the first time in weeks. Michael started stopping by more often, not out of guilt, but with a sincere effort to reconnect. He asked if we could take the kids fishing sometime, like we used to when he was little. I told him yes, of course. There was no speech, no dramatic apology. Just time. Real time. Shared time. And that was enough. Then, one Sunday afternoon, something happened that brought me to my knees in gratitude. Michael invited me to dinner. At his house, with everyone. I hesitated outside the door for a moment, remembering the last time I stood there, with bags in my hands and disappointment on my face. But when I knocked, it was his wife who answered. She smiled, not a forced smile, a real one. She said, "We're glad you're here." Inside, the kids had set the table. My name was written on a little folded napkin, Grandpa Tom in big, colorful letters. There was a plate for me, a seat, a place. I sat down and felt something shift inside me, not just forgiveness, but belonging. And during dessert, my granddaughter Sophie leaned over and whispered, "Grandpa, Mommy told us you were the one who helped Daddy go to college, that you worked really hard for all of us. That makes you a hero, right?" I swallowed hard, smiled, and nodded. Something like that. As the room buzzed with laughter and clinking silverware, I looked around at the family I'd almost lost. Not because I stopped loving them, but because for a while I forgot to love myself. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. My back still ached some mornings. Not every relationship was perfect, but I had something I hadn't had in years: peace, purpose, and pride. So if you're out there, tired, forgotten, humiliated, let me tell you what I learned. Sometimes life breaks you so it can rebuild you stronger. Sometimes love returns in unexpected ways. And sometimes the greatest riches aren't found in a lottery ticket, but in being remembered, respected, and welcomed back to the table. I'm Thomas, and I got my seat back.